In 1923, a health inspector knocked on the door of a tenement apartment on Mulberry Street in Manhattan. Inside, he found a woman named Rosa Caruso, hanging cured pork from the ceiling pipes, a wheel of homemade cheese wrapped in cloth on the windowsill, and a pot of tripe on the stove that smelled like it could knock you sideways. He fined her $3. She paid it and went right back to cooking. That scene repeated itself across Little Italies from New York to Chicago to San Francisco for decades. Italian grandmothers did not just cook food American health inspectors had never seen. They cured it in bedrooms, fermented it in basements, and brined it in bathtubs. They foraged in city parks. They slaughtered animals in back alleys. They made wine during Prohibition and hid it behind false walls. They were called unsanitary, dangerous, a public health menace. And here is the twist. Scientists and food historians are now circling back to these same recipes and calling them something different. Genius, culturally irreplaceable. Some of the most nutritionally dense, microbiologically sophisticated food traditions ever carried to this country. Number 7 on this list was specifically banned by the New York City Board of Health in 1934. Number 3 violates FDA guidelines to this day. And number 1, the dish that anchored every Sunday table from South Philly to Boston's North End, was called a public health hazard in 1952 by the same government shipping processed cheese in tin cans to school cafeterias. These 20 recipes did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because America decided it knew better than the women who had been perfecting them for 500 years. Let's start the countdown. Number 20, Sunday gravy with pork neck bones. Every Italian-American family called it something different. Gravy, sauce, the red. But the Sunday ritual was the same from Staten Island to San Jose. Pork neck bones, browned hard in cast iron until the fat rendered gold, then submerged in crushed San Marzano tomatoes and left to simmer for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours. In the 1940s, neck bones cost about 8 cents a pound at the corner butcher. Families who had left poverty in Calabria and Sicily understood that bone, marrow, and connective tissue, cooked low and slow, released a depth of flavor no lean cut could match. The collagen broke down into gelatin. The marrow enriched the sauce. The tomato acid softened through hours of heat into something smooth and complex that no 90-minute version could ever replicate. Health inspectors sometimes flagged the long room temperature, standing time, and the uncovered pots left warming overnight. Italian grandmothers nodded and ignored them completely. They had been making this gravy since before anyone in an American uniform was born. Number 19, lardo on toast. Walk into an Italian grocery in East Harlem in 1938, and you would see white slabs of it stacked in the cold case. Cured fatback, pure pork fat salted with rosemary, garlic, and black pepper, then aged for weeks in marble basins or ceramic crocks. Sliced paper thin over warm bread, it melted on the tongue into something so silky it seemed impossible it came from a 5-cent cut. By the 1950s, regulations on cured pork fat effectively pushed lardo out of most Italian-American delis. The tradition went underground, made in apartments and cellars, consumed at family tables where no inspector would ever knock. In 2003, the FDA attempted to block the importation of authentic Italian lardo on food safety grounds. The outcry from food historians reversed the decision within months. The same product your grandmother made in a coffee tin in the Bronx was declared artisanal, imported at $30 a pound to Manhattan restaurants, and sold on charcuterie boards. Number 18, braciole stuffed with hard-boiled egg. This was the dish that separated Sunday from every other day of the week. Thin slices of beef, pounded flat, layered with breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, pine nuts, raisins, and whole hard-boiled eggs, then rolled tight, tied with twine, and braised for hours in Sunday gravy until the meat turned dark and tender and the egg inside sliced into a perfect golden spiral. When cut at the table, that cross-section revealed rings of white and yolk surrounded by seasoned beef. It looked like it required professional training. It required patience, a pound of bottom round, and knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. Health officials in the 1940s were suspicious of eggs held inside cooked meat for extended periods. Braciole did not appear on restaurant menus. It stayed in kitchens where grandmothers knew that what they were doing was not dangerous. It was chemistry, practiced long before chemistry had a name. Number 17, ciccioli, fried pork fat cracklings. When a pig was butchered, nothing was wasted. The scraps of fat and skin left after rendering lard were pressed, fried again until crisp, and packed into crocks. Ciccioli were the byproduct of thrift, but they were also among the most intensely flavored things your grandmother ever set on the table. Dense, salty, crackling between the teeth, they were eaten with bread or stirred into polenta. Italian neighborhoods in Providence, Utica, and Cleveland had butcher shops selling ciccioli by the bag through the 1960s. When industrial meat processing arrived and small butchers lost access to whole animals, ciccioli vanished almost overnight. You cannot make them without the scraps, and supermarkets sell no scraps. The tradition survived only in private kitchens, passed down by families who still knew someone willing to sell them the parts the packing plant called waste. Number 16, zuppa di trippa, tripe soup with tomato and mint. Friday was a meatless day in the Italian Catholic calendar, but tripe occupied a theological gray area that grandmothers exploited with considerable creativity. Cleaned tripe simmered for hours with tomato, onion, celery, and fresh mint until silky and tender, and it was the Friday meal that filled every seat at the table. The mint cut through the richness, lifted the broth, and transformed what smelled like an alley behind a butcher shop into something you could not stop eating. In the 1950s, Italian butchers on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx sold tripe daily. By the 1980s, as that generation aged and moved to the suburbs, the market collapsed. The last tripe butcher on Arthur Avenue closed in 1991. His daughter, who did not cook it herself, said people just did not want it anymore. What she meant was that the people who wanted it were gone, and nobody had bothered to teach the next generation why it mattered. Number 15, homemade wine, the basement prohibition vintage. During Prohibition, a specific exemption allowed heads of household to produce up to 200 gallons of fruit juice per year for personal use. Italian grandfathers across America read that law carefully, nodded, and promptly began making wine. The grapes came by rail from California, unloaded at stations in Brooklyn and Chicago, and handed off to men who had been making wine since they were 12 years old in Campania. The basements of row houses became cellars. The whole neighborhood smelled of fermenting must every September. The wine was almost never particularly good by objective measure, but it was made by hand, poured at every Sunday table, and it tasted like home. When Prohibition ended, the tradition did not. Italian-American families kept making basement wine through the 1950s and the 1960s, long after they could buy it legally. The recipe was never written anywhere. It lived in the hands. Number 14, cotticino, gelatinous pork sausage simmered for hours. This was a sausage America did not understand. Made from pork rind, fat, and seasoned mince stuffed into natural casing and simmered for 3 to 4 hours until the gelatin softened the casing into something almost translucent, cotticino was served sliced over lentils on New Year's Day and at Sunday tables throughout winter. The texture was unlike any American sausage. Soft, almost spreadable, rich with gelatin, its casing yielding between the teeth. The seasonings, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, alongside pepper and salt, had no American equivalent and no American frame of reference. Health officials flagged the long simmering at uncertain temperatures. Italian grandmothers flagged the absurdity of people who knew nothing about food telling them how to cook it. Cotticino today appears on Italian restaurant menus at $22 a plate, described as artisanal and house-made. Your great-grandfather bought it from the pork store on the corner for 40 cents and simmered it next to the radiator on Christmas Eve. Number 13. Crudo, raw salted fish at the Sunday table. Southern Italian coastal communities had been eating raw, salt-cured fish for centuries before anyone invented refrigeration. Anchovies packed in salt, sardines cured in ceramic jars, thin slices of raw tuna dressed with olive oil and lemon. The salt did the work that cold could not, drawing moisture, concentrating flavor, and creating conditions no pathogen could survive. In the 1950s, American regulators could not distinguish between raw and unsafe and raw but preserved. They saw fish that was not cooked, and they reached for the citation book. Restaurants in New York's Little Italy stopped serving crudo by the 1960s. Grandmothers continued pulling salt-packed anchovies from the jar under the sink, watching grandchildren make faces and come back for seconds. The FDA today still prohibits the commercial sale of many traditionally salt-cured raw fish preparations that your grandmother needed no certification to make. Number 12. Arancini made from day-old risotto and ragu. This dish was born entirely from the refusal to waste. Leftover risotto, cold and stiff, was stuffed with a spoonful of Sunday ragu, a cube of mozzarella, and a few peas. Then it was rolled in breadcrumbs and fried until the outside shattered and the inside went molten and golden. Health officials worried about reused cooked rice. American food safety guidelines treated it with deep suspicion after unrelated commercial kitchen incidents in the 1940s. Those prohibitions targeted large-scale food handling and had nothing to do with Italian grandmothers who stored their risotto for 12 hours, then fried it to order. Italian delis in New York were cited for selling arancini made from day-old rice. The grandmothers making them at home were, as usual, beyond reach. Arancini are now sold at food markets for $4 a piece. Nobody's grandmother sells them anymore. That knowledge lives in fewer kitchens every year. Number 11. Sopressata cured in the back bedroom. The pork store in South Philadelphia made its own sopressata. So did at least a dozen families on every surrounding block, in kitchens and cold hallways, hanging cured pork from hooks and waiting. Sopressata relies entirely on the correct growth of beneficial mold on the exterior casing and the acidification of meat through natural fermentation. American regulators in the 1950s saw raw pork hanging in unrefrigerated apartments and reached for the citation book. Italian grandmothers understood that the mold on the outside was not a contaminant. It was a protector, a centuries-old living system that kept the meat safe while flavor developed within. The FDA's current home curing regulations are extensive, largely unenforceable, and largely ignored in Italian-American households where the knowledge survived. The sopressata in your great-grandmother's back bedroom was not dangerous. It was applied microbiology. refined across 500 years. Number 10. Polenta with fried eggs and gorgonzola. This was a peasant breakfast in northern Italy and a Sunday supper in Italian immigrant households in Cleveland and Detroit. Coarse polenta cooked for 45 minutes of constant stirring, poured into a shallow bowl, topped with a fried egg whose yolk ran into the grain, and scattered with crumbled raw milk gorgonzola that softened in the heat into golden threads. The cheese was the problem. In 1949, the FDA began requiring all soft cheeses imported from Italy to be made from pasteurized milk, classifying raw milk gorgonzola as a public health risk. Italian-American families pointed out that gorgonzola had been made from raw milk for at least 1,000 years without triggering the epidemic being predicted. The argument has never fully resolved itself. What resolved was the tradition. Your great-grandmother knew the difference between real gorgonzola and the pasteurized substitute with her eyes closed. The Sunday polenta supper quietly disappeared, along with the butcher shops that stocked the real thing. Number 9. Bacala salt cod soaked for days. Salt cod, dried until it resembled a wooden plank, was purchased at the Italian fish market and soaked in cold water, changed 3 times daily for 48 to 72 hours until the flesh softened, swelled, and shed enough salt to become edible. Then it was fried in olive oil, braised with tomatoes and olives, or layered into a pie. Health officials were troubled by the multi-day room temperature soaking. Italian grandmothers were troubled by health officials who apparently believed the entire Mediterranean had been dying of food poisoning for 5 centuries. Bacala defined Christmas Eve in Italian-American homes, anchoring the feast of the 7 fishes table alongside everything else the family could assemble. It required planning days in advance. When the generation of planners and soakers was gone, bacala mostly went with them. In 1955, it sat on the counter at every Italian fish market in every American city with an Italian neighborhood. Today, it is a specialty order, if you can find it at all. Number 8. Ribollita, twice-boiled bread soup. Ribollita means reboiled. It was, by design and definition, leftovers. Day-old minestrone, thick with cannellini beans, cavolo nero, and stale bread, was reheated the following day until the bread dissolved fully into the broth, thickening it to a porridge consistency, and then finished with raw olive oil and cracked black pepper. Italian grandmothers from Tuscany understood instinctively that the soup made on Thursday was good. The same soup on Friday, after a night in the pot and another hour on the stove, was better. American food safety guidelines viewed the reheating of bean soups with deep suspicion. The response of Italian grandmothers was that improperly stored anything could cause problems, and that perhaps regulators should target improper storage rather than a technique perfected across 400 years. Ribollita now appears on Tuscan-inspired restaurant menus at $16 a bowl. Your great-grandmother made it because she refused to throw away Thursday's soup. The recipe was identical. The reason was completely different. Number 7. Raw egg zabaglione, the banned Sunday dessert. In 1934, the New York City Board of Health issued a specific advisory against the preparation and commercial sale of uncooked egg preparations, citing salmonella risk. The advisory named zabaglione explicitly. Zabaglione is nothing more than egg yolks, sugar, and Marsala wine, whisked over a double boiler until thick and foamy. It never fully cooks. The eggs never reach pasteurization temperature. It is raw, or nearly raw, and has been served in Italian homes since the 15th century. Italian grandmothers across New York and New Jersey read the 1934 advisory and made zabaglione for Sunday dessert anyway. It appeared in ceramic cups alongside fruit. It was spooned over cake. It was poured warm directly into the mouths of children who had been told it was medicine, because what else could it possibly be, tasting like that? The Board of Health never managed to knock on every apartment door. The Zabaglione continued for another 60 years without a single recorded consequence. Number 6. Tripe alla romana in the apartment kitchen. This was different from the Friday tripe soup. This was Rome on a Sunday. Tripe cleaned, parboiled, cut into ribbons, and braised for hours in a sauce of tomato, guanciale, white wine, and pecorino romano, until each strip had absorbed the sauce completely and the cheese had melted into the whole. The smell was challenging. There is no other word for it. It filled the hallway. It reached the floor above and below. Neighbors who hadn't grown up with it knocked to ask if everything was all right. Everything was more than all right. Everything was spectacular. American landlords in the 1940s and the 1950s occasionally included lease clauses prohibiting the cooking of offal. Italian tenants occasionally signed those leases and ignored the clause completely. The smell of tripe alla romana on a Sunday morning was the smell of the old country, and no lease clause was going to change that. As Italian butchers who cleaned tripe properly closed their doors, the dish retreated from kitchens into restaurants, and the Sunday ritual it had anchored went with it. This was a Saturday morning ritual wherever someone still knew how. Fresh curd was heated in salted water until it became plastic and stretchy, then pulled, folded, and shaped by hand into white balls that went straight onto the Sunday table, still warm from the pulling. Fresh mozzarella pulled within hours of eating is a completely different substance from the plastic-wrapped block in the dairy case. The texture is pillowy and yielding. The flavor is clean, milky, and faintly sweet. There is a moment in the first hour after pulling when it is perfect. After that, it begins to decline. The version your grandmother made on Saturday morning was at exactly that peak when it reached the Sunday table. You can buy mozzarella at any supermarket. You can buy approximations at specialty shops. The pulled-in-the-kitchen sink version exists today only in the hands of the few remaining grandmothers and the families patient enough to learn from them before it is too late. Number 4. Pane e olio, raw garlic and olive oil on bread. This was not a recipe, it was a philosophy. Thick bread, toasted over a gas flame, rubbed immediately while still hot with a cut clove of raw garlic until the clove wore itself down to a stub. Then the bread was flooded with olive oil and scattered with coarse salt. On hot bread, the simple assembly needed no more than that, and the olive oil did the work. Italian grandmothers ate this for breakfast. They fed it to sick grandchildren. They set it out as the first thing on the Sunday table while everything else was still cooking, so nobody would faint from hunger before the pasta arrived. Raw garlic, consumed in the quantities Italian grandmothers used, had a smell that mid-century American society found deeply suspicious. Italian-American school children were sent home from school in the 1950s because teachers thought they were ill. They had simply eaten breakfast. The garlic was not a flavoring, it was a foundation. The olive oil was not a condiment, it was a food group. Together on hot bread, they created something that needed no improvement and offered no apology. Number 3. Raw milk ricotta made in the bathroom. This one still violates FDA guidelines in most states. Fresh ricotta made from raw whole milk, heated to just below boiling, curdled with a splash of white wine vinegar, drained through cheesecloth, and salted. 90 minutes, start to finish. The result was soft, still warm, slightly grainy, tasting of pure cream and nothing else. Italian grandmothers in New York apartments made this in the bathroom because it had the best combination of a deep sink, warm pipes, and a door that closed. The cheesecloth hung from the shower rod. The whey drained into the sink. The ricotta went directly to the Sunday table. The FDA prohibits the commercial sale of raw milk dairy products aged less than 60 days. Raw milk ricotta consumed the same day it is made cannot be legally sold in most American jurisdictions. Your great-grandmother made it every Saturday in complete technical violation of a law that did not exist yet, producing something that bears absolutely no resemblance to the white paste in plastic containers at the grocery store. Real, raw milk ricotta is an argument-ending food. It stops conversation. It makes people close their eyes. Your children have very likely never tasted it. That is the loss this entire list is really about. Number 2, porchetta, whole roasted pork in the backyard. This was the centerpiece of every feast day, every communion celebration, every outdoor Sunday gathering that wanted to be something more than a regular barbecue. A whole pig, butterflied and laid flat, rubbed inside with garlic, rosemary, fennel seed, black pepper, and wild fennel fronds, then rolled tight, tied with twine, and roasted for 6 to 8 hours over a wood fire until the skin crackled like breaking glass, and the internal fat had basted the meat continuously for the entire length of the cook. In cities across America, Italian families were fined for cooking porchetta in their backyards. They paid the fine and scheduled the next feast 2 weekends later. The fine was treated as a cost of tradition, factored in alongside the cost of the pig. What they produced was food at a scale and generosity that American backyard cooking never attempted. A whole roasted pig fed 40 people and left everyone arguing over the crackling. The fennel charred against the skin. The garlic sweetened over 8 hours into something caramelized and gentle. The meat pulled apart with 2 fingers. It was not a recipe. It was a declaration. Number 1, Sunday gravy left on the stove all day. This is where every entry on this list begins and ends. Not one dish, but a practice. The practice of leaving a pot of food on a low flame for an entire day, adding to it, tasting it, adjusting it, and serving it in stages across a meal that lasted 4 hours and required no fewer than 7 courses. The sauce started at 7 in the morning. Meatballs went in at 9, braciole at 10, sausage at 11. By noon, the kitchen had accumulated a density of fragrance that attached itself to clothing, hair, and memory permanently. Children who grew up in those kitchens have spent their entire adult lives trying to recreate that smell. Health officials in post-war America were consistently alarmed by cooked meat sitting in tomato sauce at low temperatures for extended periods. They produced pamphlets. They issued guidelines. They gave talks at community centers in Italian-American neighborhoods across every major city. Nobody moved the pot. The science of what happens to a long-simmered ragu after 5 hours is not dangerous. It is transformative. Flavors integrate. Collagen becomes gelatin. Acid softens. The whole pot becomes greater than the sum of its parts in a way that no shortcut ever can. This was not cooking to satisfy hunger. It was a statement that Sunday was different from every other day of the week, that the family deserved something attended to, adjusted, cared for, and beyond given time. Italian grandmothers who arrived at Ellis Island with nothing, who were fined for their hanging pork and their raw eggs and their basement wine and their smoking backyard pigs, held on to their Sundays. The pot stayed on the stove. The gravy was made. The family sat down. That was the law they kept. Tell me in the comments which one your family still makes. If your grandmother is still cooking, go sit in her kitchen and pay attention. That knowledge does not write itself down.